A king once hid a debt so large to a holy order in London that revealing it could have cost him his crown. From that single secret flows a river of hidden arrangements that shaped medieval England. Behind chapel doors and counting rooms, men in gowns and armor guarded ledgers, passwords, and seals. They moved coin across borders without moving a chest and decided who stood near the throne without ever drawing a sword. What happens to a kingdom when the quietest voices control the keys, the calendars, and the codes? In this world of oath-bound fraternities, the map of power looked nothing like the map of counties. Knights Templar and Knights Hospitaller held deposits and favors, livery companies ran the markets, and foreign merchants in a walled London enclave traded goods and news. Stonemasons kept craft words that opened careers, chivalric circles turned honor into access, and reforming readers met by candlelight to test ideas that could crack old certainties. Who kept the lists of debts, who held the right to inspect the scales, and who could speak to the sovereign at dawn. These are the trails we will follow through halls, priories, guild rooms, and royal chambers to learn how influence really moved. Some of what we find will be generous, some will be sharp, and all of it will be human. But before we get started, make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel for more ominous history videos. We greatly appreciate your support. 1307 AD Knights Templar in England. The temple in London felt more like a fortified ledger than a monastery, and that was by design. Who were these men in white mantles with red crosses that kept the money of princes as calmly as they kept the rule of prayer? In England, the Knights Templar owned halls, mills, farms, and townhouses that formed a web of influence far wider than their churches. Their preceptors were not only commanders of brothers, but stewards of estates and guardians of secrets sealed in wax. The question that haunts the start of their English story is simple and unsettling. How much leverage does a quiet banker have over a noisy king? Their power rested on things that do not glitter but decide fates. Paper promises, iron-strong rooms, and a network that reached from Yorkshire to Jerusalem. Letters of credit written in Latin crossed the channel with messengers who knew when to keep their mouths closed. Lords entrusted chests to the temple kitchens because the brothers offered three assets that outmatched any noble house: piety, discipline, and silence. When a baron begged a loan or a sheriff deposited tax revenue before shipment to the exchequer, the brothers wrote it down in neat hands and asked for no gossip. Silence is a currency, and the Templars minted it with skill. Notable figures stepped through the temple gate with the same mix of reverence and anxiety. William de la More, the last English master, oversaw a system that counted the debts of kings such as Henry III and Edward I as carefully as it counted the candles in the chapel. Bishops entrusted endowments meant to fund masses for souls, and widows asked the house to hold dowers safe from predatory kin. Imagine the guest list at a temple supper in London. Royal clerks, mercers, captains, and pilgrims, all under a single roof that spoke softly and kept good food hot. Being close to so many needs created a second power, the power to know who owed whom and how much. The secrets that swirled around the Templars in their final years are a fog that never quite clears. Accusers said they bowed before strange heads and kissed in shameful rites, and much of that was forced by threats in distant prisons. Yet the political use of those tales matters more than their truth. If you wanted to crush a bank that held your receipts, you did not need to be right. You only needed to be loud. The more convincing whispers are the mundane ones, that a clerk saw a list of baronial debts, that a prior heard a confession about a bribe, that a knight took a pledge from a royal favorite in exchange for a quiet transfer of coin. Every house that keeps a safe becomes a house that knows things. The fall of the order in England after 1307 AD unfolded with chilling speed. Inventories were drawn, keys were seized, and the clerks who had written tidy columns of figures were ordered to explain themselves. Much of the land passed to the Hospitallers, but the knowledge the Templars carried went to ground. Ledgers were boxed, memories were silenced, and favors were called in by men who never wore a white mantle. The most enduring legacy of the English Templars is not a hidden treasure, but a template. The idea that an oath-bound house can move wealth, protect secrets, and shape policy without ever raising its voice. 1381 AD Knights Hospitaller at Clerkenwell. When crowds surged through London during the Peasants' Revolt, the great priory of the Order of St. John at Clerkenwell stood like a stone rebuke to anger. Who were these black-cloaked brothers who healed the sick and advised kings in the same day? The Knights Hospitaller were the quiet heirs of much Templar property, and their English commandery at Clerkenwell became a powerhouse of rents, tithes, and spiritual prestige. They were sworn to charity and defense. Yet they also held keys to storehouses and lists of tenants that stretched across counties. Few institutions matched their blend of care and control. Their powers were both sacred and practical. The order claimed tax freedoms, ecclesiastical immunity, and the right to manage estates through its priors and bailiffs. Pilgrims found lodging and treatment at their halls, and lords found a reliable partner for moving funds to the Mediterranean. The Hospitallers managed ships and barns, sheep and armor, and they did it under the sign of the eight-pointed cross. Their charters gave them legal teeth, which meant they could sue, be sued, and negotiate with the crown from a position of unusual calm. Influence often hides in the ability to say no, and the Hospitallers could say it with a polite bow. Names give shape to power, and Sir Robert Hales makes the story immediate. As Lord Treasurer under King Richard II, Sir Robert Hales carried two burdens, the treasury of the realm and the reputation of his order. During the Rising of 1381 AD, his office made him a lightning rod when crowds wanted a face to blame for taxes. He paid with his life, yet his role shows how deeply the order's members threaded into royal governance. When the Treasurer of England wears a cross of St. John, the boundary between sacred duty and fiscal policy disappears. That disappearance is not magic, it is network. What of secrets and darker arts? Chroniclers complained that the order squeezed tenants, pushed hard on arrears, and defended its privileges with a firmness that looked like arrogance. A priory that keeps a list of noble debtors also keeps the ability to embarrass them. The brothers had no need to spread rumors to get their way. A quiet mention of a pledge given at a feast or a reminder of a charter clause could do the job. If a manor holder delayed rent, a visit from a Hospitaller sergeant with a sealed letter often brought sudden memory. Well-kept accounts can coerce without a single threat uttered aloud. The order's imprint on modern England is not a thriller ending, but a living chain. The charitable arm recognized today in St. John Ambulance descends from an ethos that braided care with organization. The very idea that a religiously inspired fraternity could run hospitals, mobilize volunteers, and serve the public under a shared symbol has medieval roots deep in Clerkenwell soil. The lesson that survives is sharp. Institutions that promise service can also amass durable leverage if they marry mercy to impeccable record-keeping. 1350 AD Teutonic Order in England. England never became a heartland for the Teutonic Order, yet their English bailiwick shines a small lamp on a wider world. Who were these brothers in white mantles with black crosses who looked east to the Baltic rather than south to Jerusalem? They were warriors, administrators, and patrons of mission, and in England their presence meant donations gathered, confraternities admitted, and influence carried into royal circles through the soft power of foreign campaigns. The English branch acted as a relay station between patrons at home and castles on the Vistula. Their powers in England took the shape of papal protections and chartered privileges that made fundraising a matter of law as well as persuasion. They could collect alms with authority, and they could promise spiritual rewards for practical gifts. The order's structure gave them a pan-European conversation. Messages from Prussia could be read in London before they were known in some ducal courts. That kind of speed made them useful to clerks and courtiers who wanted to know what winds were blowing in the north. Information is a form of capital when ships take weeks to travel. Notable English confraters and sympathizers treated the order as a chivalric cause worth supporting. Knights sought crosses in campaigns, merchants sniffed new markets, and clerics warmed to the idea of Christianizing wild lands. When an English donor signed to endow a chapel at home and a bastion abroad, the Teutonic brothers recorded it with care. Patronage is never just a gift. It is an invitation to sit nearer to the fire. Men who stood closer heard more and were heard more, which is a power not listed in any charter. Whispers of misconduct shadow every order that moves money across borders. Critics claim that English alms vanished into foreign coffers while the brothers lobbied for royal favor and eased trade concessions for friends. Were those charges fair, or were they the usual envy of a house that had friends in two languages? In truth, the line between lobbying and leaning is thin in any age. A confraternity that can place a letter on the right table at the right hour does not need to shout to get a minister's attention, and few records show those quiet moments that decide careers. The Teutonic footprint in England is a reminder that medieval secret power often looked like respectable administration. A seal, a letter, and a list of donors were tools enough to sway outcomes in distant cities. The idea that international networks can shape domestic decisions without ever holding office is familiar in the present, and it already breathed in halls where a black cross hung beside a map of the Baltic. 1420 AD, London Mercers Company Ascendant. Walk into a London hall where bolts of fine cloth glow in muted light, and you are not only in a market, you are in a chamber of influence. Who were the Mercers? They were the elite fraternity of cloth exporters and financiers whose feasts were about more than wine. Their table plans were diagrams of power. Apprentices entered by oath, freemen rose by merit and sponsorship, and liverymen in their gowns cast votes that could tilt city policy. The Mercers were not a secret society in the romantic sense, yet their closed chapters and guarded minutes made them feel as private as any lodge. Their powers were concrete. They regulated apprenticeships, audited quality, issued marks of approval, and carried sway in the election of sheriffs and the Lord Mayor. The company's court could make or ruin a small trader with a fine or a denial of admission. Add to that the influence of mercantile credit, and you have leverage that reaches beyond the city walls. A mercer who financed an expedition or advanced cash to a noble household gained a voice in rooms where few citizens were invited. If you picture a medieval pressure group with velvet gloves, you are very close. Names anchor the story, and Richard Whittington, the thrice mayor of London, stands as a symbol of mercantile rise. He had ties to the Mercers, and his philanthropy built institutions that still ripple through English civic life. William Caxton, who brought the printing press to England, had Mercer connections that show how trade, letters, and policy mingle. These men moved comfortably from counting rooms to council chambers, carrying news and proposals in the space of a walk. The company itself remained the stage on which such men rehearsed alliances before stepping into public view. What dark arts did people accuse them of using? Rivals called them price fixers and blacklisters who whispered against independent traders who refused to bend. Vote swapping in wards, selective enforcement of company rules, and strategic loans to aldermen were the usual rumors that stick to any club with means. The Mercers did not need to threaten. They could simply delay a license, invite a competitor to a dinner that did not include you, or call in a debt at an awkward moment. Soft power can leave hard marks on a ledger. The Mercers' imprint today is clear to anyone who watches city ceremonies or studies educational charities. Their wealth seeded schools and scholarships, and their structure shaped London's livery system, which still funnels civic pride into practical grants. The cautionary note is equally clear. When a closed circle directs flows of money and honor, the city can feel like a village where everything important happens after the feast has ended. 1440 AD, Goldsmiths Company, and the standard of coin. Behind a quiet doorway near the river, a scale tips and a verdict falls on silver and gold. Who were the Goldsmiths? They were guardians of the realm's precious standards, the arbiters of plate and coin who could pronounce a craftsman honest or false. Their company did not merely represent artisans. It served as a quality court with authority to search, seize, and stamp. At a time when the purity of coin meant the credibility of government, their hallmark carried the weight of law. The powers of the goldsmiths reached into vaults and treasuries. They tested coinage, advised the mint, and supervised the use of touchstones that revealed fineness. In a market that ran on trust, Their say-so could turn a trader's day from profit to ruin. The company's wardens walked with authority, and their reports reached royal ears when coin debasement threatened unrest. To command the assay is to command the conversation about value itself, and the goldsmiths spoke that language with practiced calm. Names catch the light in their story through the royal goldsmiths who served as both artisans and lenders. A goldsmith with a shop in Cheapside might fashion a cup for a countess in the morning and meet a royal clerk about a loan by evening. The social circle that orbited the goldsmiths' company contained aldermen, merchants, and courtiers who met under the excuse of weighing metal. Trust built over scales and shared wine becomes political capital when a crisis comes. Those relationships form the mesh that holds a city together in rough weather. Rumors of collusion always follow those who judge quality while also trading in it. Critics whispered that wardens tipped friends in advance of prosecutions, warned allies to melt suspect plate, or leaned on rivals to sell at discounts in return for quick approvals. In times of debasement scare, the mere hint that a company man favored a faction could send customers running. Evidence of a formal conspiracy is thin, yet the incentives are plain. Control over inspection can become control over opportunity, and temptation is a steady visitor to any shop that tests gold. The modern echo is loud. Hallmarking still protects buyers, and every auditor who minds a standard walks in the steps of those medieval wardens. The deeper echo is louder still. Whenever a private fraternity guards a public measure of value, the community must trust that private interest will serve public good. The history of the Goldsmiths Company shows that such trust requires more than fine scales. It requires clear eyes and cleaner books. 1480 AD Company of the Staple of Calais. Picture a fortress port where English wool met continental buyers, and you have the living heart of the Company of the Staple. Who were these merchants who wore livery and carried royal licenses as if they were minor nobles? They were the gatekeepers of the greatest export of medieval England, a fraternity that secured convoys, negotiated customs, and controlled who could sell the fleece that fueled kings. Their meetings were sober, their rules were strict, and their reach was astonishing. The powers they wielded came from monopoly and charter. The crown granted the staplers the exclusive right to export wool through Calais, and in return they promised steady customs revenue and a modest navy of armed escorts. Within their halls, they fixed terms, arbitrated disputes, and set penalties for interlopers. Imagine a private parliament of wool merchants who could raise a fleet and balance a budget, and you have the staple at work. Such concentrated control turned simple commerce into policy. Notable families rose from the staple into the titled world. The De la Pole clan, for example, climbed from trade to nobility through loans to the crown and deft handling of the staple's machinery. Such careers demonstrate how a commercial club can grow a household that speaks softly in one reign and holds a county in the next. The men who ran the staple learned to handle sheriffs and secretaries with the same confidence they brought to bails and brokers. Where money flows, names become institutions. Whispers of wrongdoing darkened their success. Smuggling is the shadow of monopoly, and the staple cast a long one. Critics accused members of taking kickbacks for export permissions, of protecting friends caught shipping through wrong ports, and of using loans to the crown as a shield against prosecution. A letter delivered to a clerk with a wink could erase months of inquiry. No one needed to say the word blackmail when a prominent merchant could remind a minister how much ready cash lay between the king and a crisis. The shape of their legacy today is familiar to anyone who watches sector cartels, trade associations, or bottleneck companies. Lobbying that looks like advice, enforcement that looks like discretion, and solidarity that looks like club protection still stir debate. The Company of the Staple shows both sides of coordination. It can defend the common interest of a realm, and it can tempt men to mistake their private good for the nation's good. 1490 AD Early merchant adventurers. The brightest cloth in late medieval England did not hang long on any rack. It sailed. Who were the merchant adventurers? They were a closed fraternity of exporters from York and London who bargained as a group abroad and watched one another at home. Their model was simple and ingenious. Act as one and you gain better terms in foreign ports, then keep tight discipline among members so that the benefits do not leak. Beneath this logic lay another truth. A club that commands the sea lane, commands conversations at court. Their powers derived from charters that recognized them as the voice of English cloth. They appointed governors, set bylaws, and enforced penalties on those who cheated their fellows. Abroad, they managed warehouses and negotiated with civic councils from Antwerp to Hamburg. At home, they carried influence among aldermen and councillors who needed export revenue to fund projects. When a minister asked what the cloth men thought, the answer often came from a single table with a single seal. Notable heads of the fellowship, drawn from northern cloth barons and London citizens, shaped English trade policy in ways that no solitary merchant could hope to achieve. Success depended on shared intelligence, and the adventurers cultivated correspondents who reported prices, wars, and rumors. In a world without telegraphs, a letter that arrived 3 days earlier than arrivals could change fortunes. That informational edge created a habit of mind that prized quiet speed over loud debate. What about the shadows? The fellowship punished interlopers with fines that bit and lawsuits that drained, and they were accused of leaning on officials to make life hard for non-members. When foreign cities tightened guild rules against English cloth, some adventurers were suspected of slipping bribes to soften the rules for their own bales. A clerk who ran a ledger in Antwerp could become a gatekeeper whose favor meant the difference between profit and loss. Black lists and favors seldom appear in records, but their finger marks show up in who prospered. The adventurers left a blueprint for future English trading companies. Disciplined membership, unified bargaining abroad, and mutual enforcement at home. The same approach would later scale into chartered giants that sailed to distant seas. The lesson is plain. A secret of success is not mystery, but method, shared by a sworn circle that trusts itself more than it trusts outsiders. 1470, the Hanseatic Steelyard in London. On the north bank of the Thames stood a walled enclave that felt like another country. Who were the Easterlings of the Hanse? They were a league of German towns whose London base, the Steelyard, served as a fortified counting house, cultural club, and warehouse complex. Inside its gates, men spoke Low German, kept their own rules, and dined at a common table that bound strangers into brothers. England tolerated and courted them because their ships brought timber, furs, metals, and news. Their powers rested on ancient privileges granted by kings who needed trade more than tolls. They enjoyed extraterritorial rights to try disputes among themselves, regulated weights and measures in their own compound, and bargained directly with royal agents. Think of the Steelyard as a foreign embassy that sold goods and gathered intelligence. Its scribes copied letters for aldermen and advised ambassadors who wanted a read on the Baltic before setting policy. The more trusted the advice, the more welcome the council. Notable Steelyard aldermen moved easily between the compound and the palace, carrying petitions and presents. Londoners muttered, but the truth is that a ruler gains by listening to those who load his harbors. The Hanseatic world drew Englishmen into its orbit as well. Apprentices learned German, clerks learned exchange rates, and intermarriages stitched families across the sea. The network effect turned a few storehouses into a fabric of relationships that bound London to Lubeck. Dark talk always gathers where privilege meets profit. The Steelyard was accused of customs fraud, underweight barrels, and night boat smuggling. English competitors called it a spy nest, and some of that sting is believable because merchants live on information. When a new war stirred in the Baltic, the men who dined in the long hall knew it before most courtiers. A warning whispered to a friendly minister could bend a policy small enough to escape notice and large enough to move money. That is how quiet influence works. The Steelyard's ghost lingers in the city's comfort with foreign enclaves and international finance. London learned early to profit from hosting outsiders who came with ships and secrets. The present-day language of special economic zones and investor visas echoes choices made when a German gate opened at dawn on the Thames and a wagon rolled out under a familiar crest. 1400 AD operative stonemasons' lodges. Cathedrals do not rise on sermons alone. They rise on geometry, guarded by men who take oaths. Who were the operative stonemasons? They were teams of craftsmen who carried techniques across counties and borders, bound by signs, grips, and words that marked rank and skill. A master mason ruled a lodge as firmly as a captain rules a ship, and his authority flowed from knowledge that could not be written in any simple book. You might stand beside a pillar for days and still not learn the secret of its curve unless the lodge admitted you to its confidence. Their powers came from scarcity and trust. Patrons needed their art to glorify God and crown, and masons needed stable work sites and fair pay for long seasons. Lodges negotiated rates, set hours, and protected apprentices through graded initiation. Tools became symbols that only insiders fully understood. A square meant virtue to a bishop, but it meant technique to a mason who had earned the right to hold it at ceremonies. These customs formed a code that taught men to keep counsel among brothers. Names attached to this world through figures such as Henry Yevele, the royal master mason who shaped London's skyline, and William of Wykeham, who rose from clerk of works to bishop and founder of colleges. Their careers show how closely craft and authority could overlap when a crown trusted a builder. A master who could solve an arch could also solve a budget, and a patron who saw both gifts in one man often opened doors beyond the quarry. The lodge system trained not just hands, but minds prepared for governance. Secrecy here was not sinister, yet it could be used like a lever. Lodges fined cowans, that is, unlicensed workers, and starved rivals of commissions by controlling who was judged competent. A contractor who broke faith could find every lodge door closed in a week. That kind of solidarity can drift into cartel behavior, and whispers of favoritism or bribes at hiring tables are not entirely surprising. Still, most of the dark in this story is the dark of a workshop before dawn, where a master traces a line he will teach only to a chosen few. The influence that survives is both material and symbolic. Guild traditions of graded admission, ritual tools, and sworn charity echo in later societies that claimed medieval ancestry, and the buildings themselves are stone archives of a culture of craft. Each rib and capital is a reminder that knowledge passed from mouth to ear can outlast any royal proclamation and still shape how communities honor skill. 1348 AD, Order of the Garter. A circle of knights sworn to a sovereign may look like pageantry, yet it is also a device for binding power. Who were the members of the Order of the Garter, founded by King Edward III? They were an elite, chosen from those who fought well, counseled wisely, or served loyally, and the badge they wore opened doors that stayed closed to others. The order met in chapters that recorded little and implied much. It is easier to move a kingdom when your friends dine together in velvet robes. Their powers were indirect but decisive. Membership created a corridor of access to the king where favors could be asked and granted with ceremony that hid the transaction. The order's stalls in St. George's Chapel at Windsor were seats in a theater where honor masked influence. A title conferred at a chapter could calm a rival, cement an alliance, or mark a man for high command. Ritual has a way of turning politics into destiny, and the Garter perfected that art. Notable members read like a who's who of the realm. The Black Prince, hero to some and scourge to others, sits near the head of the list. Great captains, canny counselors, and magnates who swayed shires knelt to receive the Garter and rose with a fresh bond to their sovereign. The order's fellows might argue in council, yet in chapter they shared a brotherhood that reminded them whose table they shared. That fellowship reduced the space available to outsiders and concentrated decision-making in a fragrant cloister. What of scandal and whispered leverage? The origin tale of the Garter has always carried a hint of courtly embarrassment, and later ages enjoyed the idea that a dropped garter and a gallant king launched a chivalric brotherhood. Whatever the truth, the order became a way to coax or punish without open conflict. Refusal of a stall could humble a noble. Delay of admission could signal disfavor. A rumor that a man's conduct had cost him the ribbon could cut deeper than a fine. Gossip becomes a weapon when honor is the field of battle. The order still breathes in modern England as the summit of the honors system, and its ceremonies still transmit a medieval lesson. Soft power can be strongest when it looks like mere celebration. If you want to understand how reputation becomes policy, watch a procession to St. George's Chapel and note who sits where when the prayers begin. 1410 AD Lollard Conventicles and the Known Men, a book in the common tongue, felt like contraband when the wrong eyes watched the door. The circles known as Lollard Conventicles gathered in lofts and back rooms to read scripture in English and to debate the claims of authority. They were not guilds in the craft sense, yet they were oath-bound by trust, caution, and a web of couriers who knew which lanes led to sympathetic homes. The question that animated them was simple and radical. Could a lay reader stand before God without a cleric to translate the path? Their strength came from mobility and memory rather than halls and heraldry. A sermon given at sunrise might be copied at noon and carried to another town by dusk, with key phrases tucked into the head of a skilled reciter. The circles nurtured readers who taught others to read, and they trained listeners to recall whole passages, which turned the group into a living library. Secrecy was survival rather than flourish, and signals were as humble as a lamp left burning in a certain window or a psalm hummed twice on the street. Faces emerge from the records like figures in mist. Sir John Oldcastle stands as the most famous friend of this underground, a noble who lent shelter and reputation to a movement that began among scholars and artisans. Urban weavers, scriveners, and joiners often served as messengers in London, while small gentry houses in the shires offered barns for night meetings. These friendships were not only spiritual alliances, they were also practical routes for bread, coins, and safe beds when raiding parties of officials searched the lanes. Whispers of blackmail and counter-blackmail appeared as both sides used secrecy as blade and shield. A bailiff who took a bribe to ignore a reading could be named in a quiet letter if he later turned vicious, while a clerk who caught a Lollard with a book might grant a delay in exchange for a whispered confession about a patron. The most chilling stories concern informers who switched sides twice to save themselves, leaving a trail of broken trust that hardened the movement against careless talk. Silence saved lives, and the habit of coded speech became second nature. The legacy that survives today is less about the thrill of heresy and more about the birth of conscience in English public life. The custom of lay discussion, the defense of reading rights, and the early argument that truth can be tested in the vernacular echo in later reforms and in the wider culture of private study. A society that once watched for a candle in a window taught later generations to look for light in their own language, which may be the quietest revolution of all. 1460 AD, the Neville affinity and the art of maintenance. A badge on a sleeve could open more doors than a royal writ when the Neville household moved through the north. The affinity of the Nevilles was not a club with bylaws and minutes, yet it behaved like a disciplined fraternity. Retainers, clients, and friendly justices who wore or recognized the Neville sign formed an invisible fence around lands and courts. The first question any stranger had to answer in those shires was unspoken. Whose man are you? Power grew from the mesh of obligations rather than any single charter. A steward could arrange juries, a constable could time arrests, and a household lawyer could write bonds that boxed in opponents through fees and delays. The practice known as maintenance, the patronage of suits through money and muscle, meant that a Neville petitioner often found the right sheriff on the right day with the right mood. Formal law did not vanish. It bent around a social gravity generated by a great house that fed hundreds in its hall. Names give the story a pulse, and Richard Neville, known later as the Kingmaker, learned the craft of rule in this environment of badges and bargains. Uncles and cousins ran castles, riders carried sealed notes, and small gentry families tied their fortunes to the Nevilles because the alternative was isolation. To be in the affinity was to have allies at market, at church, and at the gate of the assize, and that network meant that news and favors moved faster than any official summons. Dark practices followed the light of loyalty, and they leave a mark in complaints written by enemies and victims. Witnesses spoke of juries packed by household friends, of rival tenants harried by hunts that trampled fields, and of reluctant debtors visited at night by lads with cudgels. The overt threat need not be spoken when the badge was enough. The cleverer pressure took the form of promises rather than blows, a lease renewed for kin who testified, a rent forgiven for a reeve who forgot a detail in court. The lasting imprint of such affinities is the English comfort with party discipline and whip work in later centuries. The habit of binding men through feasts, favors, and fast messages matured into a national political style that values cohesion in the vote and unity in the corridor. The medieval lesson is stark and useful. When people eat together under a sign, they often choose in common when the doors close. 1462 AD, the Percy affinity and the law of the march. On the northern border, a Percy badge meant safe passage in one village and sudden danger in the next. The Percy affinity centered on the lords of Northumberland, guardians of the frontier who commanded musters, wardenships, and the respect of men who rode by moonlight. Their fraternity of kin, tenants, and retainers formed a shield for allies and a net for enemies. The most honest way to describe that territory is simple and true. Royal law worked best when Percy law agreed. The tools of power were familiar to any great house, yet the march sharpened them. Control of castles that summoned local levies within an hour, ties with scouts who lived in moss and peat, and rights to negotiate truces with Scottish counterparts gave the Percys a foreign policy of their own. When a raid burned a byre, the Percys could raise pursuit on the hot trod, a legal chase that blurred the line between justice and revenge. Men who lived by cattle and steel respected the badge that turned chaos into a kind of order. Names that still ring in ballads bring the tale to life. Henry, known as Hotspur, earned his fame by speed and nerve, and his households were engines that moved information as well as horses. The family's council balanced books, allocated rations, and decided which petitioners would be heard at dawn and which would wait until the next market day. A retainer who pleased his captain might be placed as a bailiff, and a bailiff who pleased his lord might find his son apprenticed in a town with better fortunes. The darker stories come from feud, and they run like a black thread through local memory. Rivalries with the Nevilles turned musters into standoffs and courts into stages where men performed obedience while counting spears outside. Tenants who paid rent late might find their hedges cut by unknown hands, and jurors who defied expectation risked a ride in a covered cart with a hood over the head. More subtle was the gift that came with a timely warning about a raid, followed by a request for support in a later suit. Favors can bind as tightly as fear. The legacy of the Percy world is alive in the English idea that border service requires local knowledge, and that local knowledge grows in clans and clubs. The habit of trusting wardens and marshals who know every ditch and footpath endures in modern security culture, a reminder that the frontier trains its own fraternities, and that those fraternities never forget who sat by their fires. 1469 AD Warwick Council in the shadows. Every great lord keeps a household council, but the council that formed around the Earl of Warwick gained a reputation for quiet impact. This inner circle gathered captains, clerks, and heralds who planned campaigns and managed news with care and precision. It met in chambers before dawn and after dusk, and it recorded little more than was needed to justify action. The question that gives this body its dark allure is pointed and hard. How do a few men tilt a realm without ever holding a formal office of state? Its strength lay in access and speed. Warwick's men could release letters to sheriffs and port officials within hours of a decision, could prime friendly preachers with talking points before a feast, and could arrange the presence of the right alderman at a city gate precisely when a messenger arrived from court. Such choreography looks like fate to outsiders, yet it is only the fruit of rehearsals that begin months before public events. The council mastered that slow preparation that makes sudden change appear natural. The names that orbit this circle include trusted nobles like Oxford and Montague, along with clever administrators who kept accounts and sealed crates of coin at a signal. Squires who led retinues by day copied manifestos by night, and heralds who memorized pedigrees also learned to read crowds. The inner circle was not a conspiracy so much as a machine that turned loyalty and letters into momentum, which is often what power really needs. Whispers about their methods grew sharper when rivals disappeared into custody for a few days at crucial moments, or when shipments of arms failed to arrive for households that had chosen the wrong side. There are tales of commissions of oyer and terminer used to threaten, of packed assemblies that gave a shine of consent to plans made in private, and of a short episode where a king found himself living in comfort with fewer choices than his rank should allow. The council did not need to boast when outcomes spoke for them. What remains in the culture is a caution and a craft. The English art of briefing allies, shaping the agenda before the meeting, and counting heads long before a vote reflects skills honed in those years. The Shadow Council shows that the most decisive actions often look like hospitality, and the most effective pressure can arrive dressed as good manners. 1483 AD, Margaret Beaufort, and the Pledge Web. A devout widow with a quiet manner should not frighten seasoned courtiers, yet Margaret Beaufort made powerful men reconsider their positions with nothing more than letters and promises. Her network of kin, household officers, and sympathetic clerics forged a web that held when storms tore at the realm. The central question of her story is worth asking aloud. How far can a woman of intelligence reach in a world that pretends to ignore her voice? Her method was to turn piety and patronage into instruments. Gifts to churches opened chancels for private conferences, endowments nourished scholars who carried messages wrapped in their books, and household appointments placed loyal men close to other households that needed watching. She preferred paper to steel and oaths to blades, and she wrote in a tone that mixed warmth with a firmness that could not be mistaken. The power to offer a future grant of land in exchange for present discretion proved irresistible to many who needed hope. Names that stand at her side include the quick-minded Bishop John Morton and a circle of gentry who found that a little courage, reinforced by a little coin, could change the course of years. A duke called Buckingham appears in these pages as both partner and lesson in the risks of ambition, and smaller figures move in and out of reach as opportunities opened and closed. These alliances were not public, yet they were not purely secret. They were visible to those who knew how to read the pattern of visits and gifts. Charges of manipulation arise whenever rewards follow bravery, and there were accusations that Beaufort's circle used soft blackmail to persuade. A man with a questionable title might be reminded that a friendly royal council in the future could confirm or deny his claim, and then he might be invited to dinner with someone who could carry a message across a guarded courtyard. No threats needed to be spoken when the ledger of favors and risks lay open in every mind at the table. Her influence persists in the English sense that careful coalition building and well-placed gifts can accomplish more than bravado. The founding of colleges and the endowment of learning that bear her name reflect a truth she embodied. Education is a lever that shifts generations, and a letter written with steadiness can move a giant who thinks himself unshakable. 1465 AD, the Paston and Fastolf network and the law of paper. The letters that the Paston family saved give a near-perfect view of how influence traveled by ink. Their connection to Sir John Fastolf and the contested claims that followed his death show how a web of clerks, bailiffs, and friends could seize or secure manors without drawing a sword. The opening mystery in their case is timeless. How do ordinary people learn to act like a private institution when facing stronger rivals? Their tool was relentless documentation. Drafts of wills, copies of bonds, lists of tenants, and inventories of goods turned into shields when carried to the right desk at the right hour. The family engaged lawyers who knew which court would be slow and which would be swift, and they hired servants who could ride through dusk with a sealed packet to a sheriff who had already been softened by talk in a tavern. The Pastons learned that the man who controls the pace of paperwork often controls the outcome. Faces in this network include Margaret Paston, resolute in defense of her house, and a small army of clerks whose names we now barely recall, yet whose hands shaped fortunes. The Fastolf connection provided a stream of contested assets, and each contest became a lesson in management of information. The household became a school of memory, where servants learned which steward could be trusted and which notary needed the compliment of a small gift to read a file with extra care. The dark edge of the tale reveals a familiar set of tactics. Coaching of witnesses who needed to remember events in a certain order, armed possession of disputed properties under the cover of an old writ, and calculated delays that starved opponents of patience and coin. Letters describe threats whispered at market and hints that a complaint might vanish if an old debt were forgiven or if a marriage alliance could be proposed. Aggression wore the clothes of administration and called itself prudence. The lesson that enters the bloodstream of English culture through this story is the faith in paper as both weapon and refuge. The habit of saving receipts, of writing minutes, and of keeping personal copies of formal records grows from such struggles. A family that learned to survive by pen anticipated a nation that would come to govern itself with files. 1390 AD, the Cinque Ports Brotherhood and the price of privilege. Along the channel, the towns known as the Cinque Ports formed a league that married duty with reward. Their ships defended coasts and carried armies when kings called, and in return, they enjoyed exemptions and liberties that made them near sovereign in their borough courts. The initial question posed by their story is bracing. When a town defends a kingdom, how much of a kingdom does that town come to own in practice? Their strength issued from charters that confirmed rights to hold courts, to levy certain tolls, and to manage harbors with minimal interference. They elected their own officers, chose jurats for their benches, and sent barge loads of advice to royal councils on matters of trade and security. War turned their harbors into strategic prizes, and peace turned their quays into bustling bazaars where information and imports changed hands with equal speed. Autonomy became the coin with which they paid themselves for service rendered. Names that pass through their records include famous Lords Warden, who acted as both protectors and overlords, with figures of national standing lending weight to an alliance of local pride. The wardens coaxed cooperation in time of danger and mediated quarrels over wrecks, salvage, and river mouths. Beneath them, shipmasters and aldermen formed cliques in taverns where bargains were struck and where foreign captains learned the going rate for favor. Charges of piracy wrapped in parchment followed the league for good reason. Privateering with letters of marque could shade into theft, and contraband often found the right tide at the right hour when a friendly jurat turned his gaze to a brighter lantern. Merchants who were not of the ports complained of fees that bit too sharply, and of verdicts that seemed to favor neighbors over strangers. More chilling are the stories of night seizures that were later blessed by tidy court entries which left victims with no remedy but prayer. The afterglow of the ports shines in ceremonies and offices that still draw respect, yet the deeper legacy lives in the English argument about local privilege and national oversight. When a community bears arms for the Commonwealth, it will ask for freedom in return, and the balance between those two claims is a debate that never quite ends. 1425 AD, the stannary men and the tinners' parliaments. In the West, the men who dug tin carved out a jurisdiction to match their craft. The stannary parliaments of Devon and Cornwall met under charters that granted miners their own courts, their own officers, and a measure of freedom from outside interference. The first question to confront anyone reading their story is pointed. What happens when a technical guild becomes a small state? Their strength lay in shared knowledge turned into united action. Assayers guarded recipes, smelters guarded temperatures, and brokers guarded contacts with foreign buyers who loved English tin. Together they enforced standards, punished fraud, and defended their right to be tried in their own courts for most offenses connected with their work. When a tax was proposed that they judged unfair, they could threaten to lay down tools, and the mere rumor of a stoppage could empty treasuries that relied on their dues. The figures who animate this world include stannators, who served as representatives and made treaties of a sort with crown envoys. These men were often mine owners or respected captains, whose reputations in the pits gave weight to their words in halls where clerks took notes. Their letters and petitions show a tone of frankness toward authority that comes only from confidence in unity and confidence in the market that bought their metal. The accusations thrown at the stannary men follow the classic pattern of any strong trade body, that they shut out outsiders with rules framed as safety, that they cut rights of way across common lands and paid after the fact, and that they meted rough justice to those who cheated partners or spoke too freely to taxmen. The most feared weapon was desertion, a coordinated absence that stopped furnaces and sent buyers to other shores, after which officials returned with kinder terms. Their influence runs into the present through the English habit of respecting specialist jurisdictions and through the national memory that skilled workers can bargain as a block for fair laws. The stannaries teach that the people who understand a process most deeply will often demand a voice in how that process is governed, and that such demands can be both prickly and productive. 1370 AD Benedictine power blocks and the politics of sanctuary. Great abbeys were not only houses of prayer, they were engines of management that spanned shires. Benedictine monasteries, like St. Albans and Westminster, controlled manors, held courts, and maintained scribal rooms where documents were crafted with exacting care. The opening challenge posed by their story invites clear thought. How does a community that vows stability move a kingdom without leaving its cloister? Their strength flowed from three sources that fed one stream: land that paid rents in coin and kind, learning that produced clerks and advisors for princes, and sanctity that granted authority in disputes. Sanctuary rights allowed them to protect fugitives who reached their doors, and such protection became a bargaining chip when creditors or sheriffs wanted bodies more than justice. The abbots negotiated with ease because they spoke the language of both devotion and revenue. Names rise from the roll with the calm of men used to rule. Abbot Thomas de la Mare of St. Albans, among others, commanded respect in royal circles and managed tenants with a steady hand. A great abbot could advise councils in the morning and settle a boundary feud in the afternoon, and he could do both with an air of tranquility that made rivals look rash. A clerk trained in a monastic school carried that calm into chancery, where forms and formulas tamed tempers. The darker corners of the monastic story are lit by complaints of rent rises and of hardness toward tenants in years of poor harvest. Sanctuary sometimes shielded debtors who should have met their obligations, which in turn tempted abbey officers to extract gifts before releasing protected men to the king. There are tales of charity announced from the pulpit, while stewards quietly pressed arrears in the yard, and few neighbors doubted that a great house knew how to reward friends and freeze foes with equal elegance. The durable legacy of these abbeys is visible in legal habits and in the civic idea that corporate charity and education can sit beside profitable estate management. The tension between mission and margin, between sanctity and surplus, remains a living theme in English institutions that still claim medieval roots. A good abbey taught a hard lesson. To do lasting good requires the discipline to gather and guard resources, and that discipline can look cold to those who do not keep the books. 1330 AD Cistercian land trusts and the silent ledger of wool. Cistercian houses entered the English landscape with a love of plain worship and left it with a reputation for superb management. Their granges, mills, and flocks turned hillsides into engines that produced wool for export and coin for construction. The first question their success raises is crisp. When a reforming order becomes rich, does the wealth serve the vow, or does the vow serve the wealth? Their power came from organization that would impress any modern manager. Lay brothers handled farming while choir monks kept time in prayer, and stewards tracked yields with an eye that missed little. Rivers were diverted to turn wheels, valleys were cleared for sheep, and deals were struck with merchants who knew the path from English abbey to Flemish loom. A house that could predict next winter's clip could also predict next spring's repair, which made their budgets steady and their reputations strong. Names of particular abbeys shine through trade records that list Fountains, Reval, and Byland, among others, as producers of quality fleece. Abbots met buyers in chapter houses that smelled of lanolin and ink, and those meetings stitched together a network that crossed regions without the need for public display. The quiet of their halls hid the noise of wagons on the road, and the stillness of their choirs hid the calculations that kept barns full. Accusations made by neighbors repeated a familiar chorus that Cistercian expansion swallowed commons, pushed out smallholders, and introduced strictures that favored the house in local courts. There were stories of floods redirected that harmed mills downstream and of toll exemptions used to outcompete local traders. Nothing here resembles scandalous rites or midnight plots. The darkness was cool and administrative, the kind that arrives in rules written by confident men. Their influence survives in the English law of trusts and in the cultural respect for institutions that steward assets over centuries. The notion that a corporate body can hold land for a purpose larger than any single person entered the bloodstream of the realm through such orders. A wool ledger kept in a cell taught later ages that careful records, ethical aims, and efficient work can live together, though not without friction. 1414 AD alien priories and the war chest problem. In a quiet English valley, a bell rang for prayers, while rent from the surrounding fields sailed by ledger to a mother house across the channel. The houses called alien priories were outposts of grand abbeys based in France that had planted daughter cells in England during calmer centuries. Their monks wore the same habits and kept the same hours as their cousins abroad, yet their books recorded a flow of coin that made ministers look twice during wartime. The simple question that sharpened every debate about these houses was this: should English rents feed foreign cloisters when kings needed every penny for ships and spears? The power of the alien priories came from old charters sealed by kings who prized learning and reform long before the wars with France hardened hearts. Those charters affirmed immunity in certain suits, protected tolls, and respected the right to remit surplus to the mother house. Priors managed mills, fisheries, and town properties with experienced stewards who knew every boundary stone and every stubborn tenant. The reach of a prior was local in geography, yet international in effect, since a clerk in Rouen or Cluny could expect a neat summary of English incomes each season. That blend of parochial duty and continental loyalty created a tension no sermon could resolve. Notable English royal councils wrestled with this tension as the wars lengthened. Under Edward III, and later under Henry V, the crown moved to seize or to naturalize many of these priories. Some became denizen houses that swore a fresh loyalty to the English realm and kept their funds in country. Others saw their assets transferred to new colleges or to noble foundations that promised to pray for the same souls with local voices. Behind each policy stood treasurers and clerks who understood that the first rule of endurance is to keep the war chest full. The darker stories tied to alien priories usually involve suspicion more than proof. Neighbors called them a pipeline to the enemy and accused them of sending coded letters in the margins of pious texts. Officials alleged that some priors sheltered travelers who carried more news than relics, and that absolution was bartered for information about troop musters or grain prices. Whether those charges were fair or not, the climate of fear made them persuasive, and a house that could not shake the rumor of disloyalty found itself weighed down by silent enemies in town halls and at markets. What remains from this chapter is a shaped landscape of endowments that changed hands and missions. Colleges grew on the bones of former priories, and local patrons learned to keep wealth anchored where it was raised. The habit of auditing charitable bodies that hold land grew stronger, and the culture absorbed a lesson about accountability that still resonates. When a community asks where its rents are going, it is already practicing the first steps of civic oversight. 1450 AD Inns of Court cabals and the language of power. In a hall lit by candles and warmed by argument, the lawyers of the Inns of Court ate together, read cases aloud, and decided who among the students would be called to the bar. These were not monasteries, yet they kept a rule of dining and learning that formed character as surely as any cloister. Their power was obvious to anyone who watched a suit rise or fall on a phrase chosen by a bench of readers who could quote authorities with graceful speed. The question that gives their world its edge is direct. Who watches the watchers when the gatekeepers of law feast in the same rooms where they train their friends? The authority of the inns flowed from custom and from the practical necessity of keeping standards in a craft where words move property and liberty. Inner and Middle Temple, Gray's Inn and Lincoln's Inn, taught procedure, hosted moots, and maintained the unwritten etiquette that decides whether a young advocate will be heard with patience or with a tap of the table. The benchers were guardians of tone as much as of rule, and that soft control shaped careers before the first real brief was ever opened. A society that teaches the very manner of speaking rules more than statutes might suggest. Names that rise from this world include jurists who advised the crown and wrote treatises that outlived their authors. Sir John Fortescue represents the type with clarity, a crown lawyer who defended English law as a shield of liberty while also serving royal needs with distinction. Around such figures clustered clerks, ushers, stewards, and librarians who knew who sat where at dinner and who owed whom a favor for a learned citation whispered at the right moment. Knowledge of precedents and seating charts became knowledge of influence and policy. The darker tales here speak of case-fixing gossip, of juries packed by subtle client networks, and of a language so technical that it could be used to hide outcomes behind phrases that only insiders fully understood. A petitioner who lacked a friend at an inn might find his case delayed beyond usefulness, while a rival with friends could find a writ processed with astonishing speed. No one needed to use rough threats when a nod in hall and a note passed under a trencher could redirect a file to a reader with known opinions. The mark left on modern England by these fraternities is visible to any visitor who watches a call ceremony or attends a lecture in an ancient hall. The rituals endure, and so does the conviction that a profession can regulate itself through shared meals and shared values. The caution endures as well. Excellence must be measured by open standards if the public is to trust a craft that can remake a life with a sentence spoken in calm Latin or clear English. 1472 AD, the Royal Chamber Circle and the politics of access. A sovereign sleeps behind a door guarded by men who hold no great titles, yet hold the keys to time. The esquires and gentlemen of the royal chamber formed a circle defined by proximity, a fraternity of service that could lift a petition to a royal ear or let it languish in a pile untouched. During the personal rule of Edward IV, the chamber became the engine room of favor, a place where appointments, pardons, and contracts could be secured by those who knew the routine of mornings and the rhythm of evenings. The question that makes this circle so compelling is pointed. How much does a nation depend on the habits of the room nearest the bed? The chamber's power grew from control of schedule and from mastery of the paperwork that frames a sovereign day. Who was admitted at prime, which letters were read with breakfast, which warrants moved from table to signet and from signet to seal. These choices gave shape to policy as surely as any debate in council. Gentlemen of the chamber escorted visitors, gauged moods, and smoothed quarrels among courtiers before resentment could curdle into faction. The entire machine depended on trust, and trust depended on familiarity that is invisible to outsiders. Notable chamberers gain little fame in chronicles, yet their shadows fall across major events. The men who served Edward IV filtered influence from merchants in London to captains in the shires, often by choosing the hour for a meeting or the order of petitions in a stack. The Lord Chamberlain held formal authority, but it was the quiet esquire who could turn a day by suggesting that a walk in the garden might clear a clouded mind before a hard decision. This is influence at its most human and its least recorded. The whisper of darker practice is never far when access decides fortune. Some chamber officers sold introductions, others compiled mental lists of debts and indiscretions that could be used to nudge a stubborn courtier toward cooperation. A note about a gambling loss could be turned into a reminder to support a measure in council. A rumor about a private liaison could become an unspoken request to withdraw an inconvenient suit. Coercion did not need to raise its voice because a raised eyebrow in a narrow corridor could do the work. The chamber tradition survives in modern forms as private secretaries, chiefs of staff, and small teams that guard calendars for leaders in every field. England learned early that the shortest hallway can be the longest lever, and that public outcomes can be set by private rhythms. The lesson is not to despise such systems, but to recognize their power and to insist on ethics for those who hold the keys. 1495 AD, border Reiver Brotherhoods and the price of protection. The high moors of the northern marches bred families who rode for kin and for cattle in a world where the line between raid and reprisal blurred at every turn of the moon. The Brotherhoods, known to later ages as border Reivers, lived by fast musters, trusted oaths, and secret paths. They formed bonds across parishes and bloodlines that were both practical and intense, and they enforced their own rules with a speed that left royal messengers far behind. The opening question here is blunt. What does justice look like when a night ride can cross a county before a dawn court sits? Their power rested on mobility, on kin solidarity, and on arrangements with wardens who knew that harsh law often backfired. Hot-trod pursuit allowed men to cross boundaries in chase of stolen goods, and that permission became a cover for private wars that wore the clothing of law. Signals from hilltop fires and coded horn calls moved men to saddles in minutes, and their ponies could slide through bog and stone with the ease of trout in a stream. Information kept these bands alive, and informants in farms and towers earned quiet protection. Names echo in ballads and journals. Armstrongs, Nixons, and Grahams on the English side stood mirror to Scotts, Kerrs, and Elliots across the line, and at times they made truces that respected harvests while preparing for the next cycle of raids. A captain who treated neighbors fairly could gather men from several valleys, while a brute who burned crofts without cause found his nights interrupted by hooves and sparks. Leadership mattered as much as blood, and a wise head could turn a feud into a profit with one bargain over pasture rights and passage fees. The darker practices were openly named in the slang of the marches. Blackmail meant black rent, a payment for protection that was part insurance and part extortion, and many a smallholder paid both sides as seasons changed. Courts held by wardens often looked like markets where fines were priced and friendships were weighed. Abductions for ransom and forced hostages left bitter stories that lingered in families for generations, and juries chose silence when fear rode at dusk in familiar colors. The long shadow of this world stretches into modern understandings of border security and community resilience. Authorities learned that intelligence from locals beats patrols from faraway towns, and communities learn that private arrangements can turn into bad habits if not checked by fair courts. The marches teach that peace on a frontier depends on networks as much as on forts, and that a promise kept at a kitchen table can bind more tightly than a proclamation from a distant hall. 1460 AD Court Alchemists and the Book of Secrets. In a small chamber warmed by a brazier, a canon with ink-stained fingers traced symbols in a margin, while a noble patron waited for an answer that promised gold or healing, or both. Court alchemists and secret scholars moved at the edge of respectability, protected by licenses that allowed experiments and encouraged by patrons who loved the idea of hidden knowledge turned into public wealth. The puzzle at the center of their story remains irresistible. How much of progress begins as a rumor that someone has found a new key? Their power flowed from a rare mix of learning and discretion. They held access to books that most men never saw. They knew recipes for dyes and metals that improved weapons and cloth, and they kept notebooks written in ciphers that protected both the scholar and the sponsor. A respected figure like George Ripley wrote treatises that offered a ladder of symbols rather than a clear set of steps, which preserved mystique while also steering apprentices toward genuine study. The court valued these men because even a failed experiment could teach a useful trick. Notable patrons crossed the line between piety and curiosity with ease. Clerics who led chapters by day consulted on furnaces by night, while nobles who funded chapels also paid for alembics and herbs. A scholar who could gild a reliquary with thinner layers than any rival might earn a seat near the fire and a long conversation with a treasurer. This was not only a hunt for gold from base metal, it was an early research program aimed at better inks, faster hardening cements, longer-lasting oils, and more brilliant glass. The shadows in this chapter come from temptation more than from malice. Some alchemists sold hope to the desperate and wrapped failures in cloudy words that kept fees flowing. Others strayed close to counterfeiting and needed royal licenses to keep the mint from their door. A few learned the value of information and traded recipes to factions in return for protection, while keeping secret notes on the weaknesses and appetites of patrons who might one day need a gentle reminder to pay a debt. Blackmail thrives where expectation outruns delivery, and a scholar who knows a lord's private fears can negotiate more than another sack of coal. The legacy that matters here is the birth of a method, even in the midst of symbol and secrecy. Repeated trials, careful notes, and communities of readers who corrected one another created a path from wonder to knowledge. England carried that habit forward into later scientific circles that prized experiment over rumor, even as they kept the pleasures of a closed meeting and a shared code. A culture that once believed a substance could change into gold learned that ideas can change into tools, which is the better transmutation. How these secret societies affect England today. Modern England still runs on frameworks first perfected by oath-bound fraternities. Trust and equity law echo the medieval practice of separating ownership from benefit, which lets charities and institutions hold assets for public aims across generations. The Inns of Court continue to train and admit advocates through rituals that teach discipline and discretion, and their halls remain the quiet engines that set standards for who may speak in the name of justice. In the city, livery companies still fund schools, apprenticeships, and research, while their voting traditions shape civic identity and the election of the Lord Mayor. Even the hallmark on a piece of silver owes its authority to the old goldsmith's guardianship of standards, a reminder that private expertise can safeguard public confidence when it is held to account. Public ceremony also carries medieval DNA that still directs real decisions. The Order of the Garter models how the nation recognizes service at the highest level, turning honor into a living incentive for duty. St. John Ambulance draws on hospitaller ideals to train volunteers, equip events, and support emergencies, making an ancient vow of care visible on modern streets. Boardrooms and cabinet rooms work to a rhythm that would be familiar to royal chamber officers, where access, timing, and preparation determine whose petition is heard and which document reaches the top of the stack. Even the word blackmail, born on the border, reminds the law to watch for private pressure that dresses itself as protection, and that vigilance shapes policing, compliance, and corporate ethics today. The lasting effect is a national style that prizes service, confidentiality, and standards while insisting on scrutiny. England trusts professions to regulate themselves, yet expects audits, registers, and public reporting to keep enclosed rooms aligned with the common good. Charitable trusts publish accounts because medieval endowments taught the public to ask where the rents go. Professional vows carry real weight because guild oaths taught careers to begin with responsibility. Honors, convocations, and calls to the bar give citizens rituals to believe in, and oversight gives those rituals credibility. The medieval method endures, yet it serves the present only when record-keeping is transparent, access is fair, and loyalty to a circle is matched by loyalty to the realm. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe for more ominous history videos. See you in the next one.